Imagine you have spent the last decade making life or death decisions in a fraction of a second, operating in the most volatile environments on Earth. Then, one day, you trade your tactical gear for a tailored suit, and your biggest crisis is a quarterly earnings report. It sounds like a massive disconnect, doesn't it? But what if the exact same strategic frameworks that dictate global military maneuvers and the shadowy operations of special forces are exactly what the modern corporate boardroom desperately needs? Today, we are pulling back the curtain on the invisible threads that connect combat leadership, elite military strategy, and the shifting tectonic plates of global alliances. Are we looking at a new breed of corporate titans, or are we witnessing the overextension of both human capital and international coalitions?
That transition from the battlefield to the boardroom is absolutely fascinating, and it is happening against the backdrop of a world that feels increasingly unstable. We are looking at a landscape where the traditional lines of conflict are completely blurred. You have special forces operating in the gray zones, wielding influence far beyond kinetic action, and at the same time, you have massive legacy institutions like NATO trying to figure out if their sheer size is their greatest asset or their fatal flaw. When you look at all of this through the lens of strategic analysis, looking at the internal strengths, the macro-environmental factors, the core missions, you realize that whether you are a transitioning veteran or a massive geopolitical alliance, the fundamental challenge is exactly the same. It is all about adapting to a world where the old rules simply do not apply anymore.
Let's start with that human element, the veteran stepping into the corporate world. If we were to break this down, looking at the inherent strengths and vulnerabilities, the immediate assumption from the civilian side is that military leaders are rigid. People think of a strict chain of command, barking orders, absolute compliance. But that is a complete misunderstanding of modern combat leadership, isn't it? The real strength these individuals bring isn't rigidity, it is extreme adaptability under pressure. But where does the friction happen? Because it is clearly not a seamless plug-and-play transition into a Fortune 500 company.
The friction happens in the ambiguity of purpose. In the military, especially in elite units, the mission is crystal clear. Everyone knows the overarching objective, the strategy, and the tactics. You have a unified vision. In the corporate world, that clarity is often missing. The mission statement might be a paragraph of corporate jargon on a website, but the actual day-to-day reality is driven by shifting profit margins, office politics, and fragmented departmental goals. So the weakness isn't in the veterans' capability. It is a cultural mismatch. They are trained to execute a strategy with absolute precision, but they suddenly find themselves in an environment where the strategy changes depending on who is in the room. The real threat to their success is losing that sense of profound purpose. When you go from saving lives to increasing shareholder value by 2%, there is a massive psychological toll.
It is like trying to navigate a ship using a map of the stars, but half the stars are just satellites moving in random orbits. The tools they have are incredible crisis management, cross-functional team leadership, rapid risk assessment. But the environment doesn't always value those tools until something goes catastrophically wrong. And speaking of environments where things can go catastrophically wrong, this brings us perfectly to the tip of the spear in modern conflict. We are seeing special forces deployed not just as shock troops, but as diplomats, intelligence gatherers, and strategic assets. How has their role shifted in a geopolitical landscape that is shaped just as much by economic sanctions and cyber warfare as it is by traditional combat?
They have become the ultimate asymmetric tool. If you look at the macro environment today, the political instability, the economic interdependence, the rapid technological advancements, you realize that massive, conventional wars are incredibly costly and politically unpalatable. So, nations project power in the shadows. Special forces are no longer just kicking down doors. They are conducting foreign internal defense, training allied militias, engaging in psychological operations, and operating in this murky space between peace and war. Their strength is their small footprint and their disproportionately high impact. But the vulnerability here is strategic exhaustion. We are asking these elite operators to be warriors, politicians, and social workers all at once. There is a very real danger of over-reliance. When a government sees every geopolitical problem as a nail, they start treating their special forces as the only hammer.
That over-reliance is a fascinating point. It is almost a paradox. Their operational success makes them the go-to solution, which in turn stretches them incredibly thin. It makes you wonder about the long-term sustainability of that approach. If you are constantly deploying your most elite assets to patch up geopolitical cracks, you aren't actually fixing the foundation. You are just buying time. And that macro-level foundation is exactly what institutions like NATO are supposed to represent. NATO was built as this massive unified shield, but as it expands, taking on new members and new mandates, we have to ask the hard question: is this expansion a sign of undeniable strength, or are we looking at a classic case of strategic overreach?
That is the defining question of our era. On paper, NATO's expansion looks like a massive strength. You are adding economic power, territorial depth, and military capabilities. You are projecting a unified front that theoretically deters aggression. But when you analyze the internal mechanics, the picture gets incredibly complicated. Every new member brings their own political baggage, their own economic vulnerabilities, and their own historical grievances. The decision-making process in NATO requires consensus. Imagine trying to get 30-plus nations, each with their own domestic political pressures and economic realities, to agree on a rapid response to a complex, multi-layered threat. The more you expand, the slower you become. The sheer size of the alliance threatens to dilute its core mission.
Exactly. It is the difference between being big and being agile. And in today's landscape, as we just discussed with special forces, agility is often far more valuable than sheer mass. If NATO becomes too bureaucratic, too slow to respond to cyber threats or economic coercion because it is entirely focused on conventional territorial defense, it risks becoming a relic. It is like a massive corporate conglomerate that dominates the market but is completely blind to a nimble tech startup that is about to disrupt their entire industry. The core mission has to remain sharply defined. If the goal is collective defense, what does defense actually mean in an era where a hostile nation can cripple your infrastructure without ever crossing your border with a tank?
That is exactly where all these threads pull together. Whether you are a veteran transitioning into a corporate leadership role, a special forces operator navigating a politically sensitive mission, or a massive alliance like NATO trying to justify its existence in the 21st century, the ultimate test is strategic alignment. You have to clearly define your overarching objective, understand your internal strengths and vulnerabilities, and constantly scan the political, economic, and technological horizon. The veterans who succeed in the corporate world are the ones who learn to translate their tactical agility into long-term business strategy. They figure out how to build consensus without relying on a strict chain of command.
And they do it by recognizing that the battlefield has simply changed its shape. The stakes might be different, but the human element, the need for clear communication, resilience, and adaptability remains exactly the same. It makes you realize that the most valuable asset in any organization, whether it is the military or a multinational corporation, isn't the technology or the budget. It is the human capacity to look at a chaotic, unpredictable environment and impose a sense of order and purpose. But that requires a willingness to honestly assess our weaknesses. If we just blindly rely on past successes, if NATO assumes it will always be relevant just because it won the Cold War, or if a veteran assumes their rank will automatically command respect in a boardroom, we are setting ourselves up for a profound failure.
Absolutely. The graveyard of history is full of empires, alliances, and corporations that refuse to adapt. They mistook their size for strength and their past victories for future guarantees. The reality is that the geopolitical and corporate landscapes are unforgiving. They demand constant evolution. The Special Forces community understands this better than anyone. They operate on the bleeding edge of change, constantly updating their tactics, their technology, and their cultural understanding to meet the threat where it is, not where it used to be. That is the mindset that is required across the board today.
It is a sobering thought, but also an incredibly empowering one. It strips away the illusion that we can just coast on legacy systems, whether those systems are military alliances or corporate hierarchies. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, From the personal, psychological journey of the combat veteran stepping into the corporate arena to the shadowy, high-stakes world of elite operators, all the way up to the existential questions facing the world's most powerful military alliance. It all comes down to how we define our purpose and how honestly we confront our own vulnerabilities in a world that is shifting under our feet.
It really does. And as we look toward the future, the organizations and the leaders that will thrive are not necessarily the ones with the most resources or the biggest armies. They will be the ones who can navigate ambiguity with grace, who can translate complex geopolitical shifts into actionable strategies, and who never lose sight of the human element at the core of every mission. The transition is never easy, whether it is a personal career pivot or a global strategic realignment, but it is absolutely essential.
Essential and perhaps the only true measure of leadership we have left. If you are listening to this and you find yourself in a transition of your own, or if you are trying to steer an organization through these murky waters, ask yourself, are you relying on the strategies of the past, or are you actively shaping the tactics of the future? The boardroom, the battlefield, and the geopolitical stage are more connected than they have ever been. The rules of engagement have changed. The only question now is whether we are ready to play the new game. We will leave you with that thought to chew on. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative and keep looking beyond the surface.
Discover the new Sentinel, where pop culture glamour meets military strategy and global affairs. In-depth discussions, expert interviews, compelling storytelling. Whether you love Hollywood or high-stakes geopolitics, we've got you covered. Like, comment, and share to join the conversation and help us grow. Brands and businesses. Looking to reach a highly engaged audience? The new Sentinel offers premium sponsorship opportunities. Contact us today at claybait@yahoo.com. Mail to claybait@yahoo.com for sponsorship packages and advertising rates.